You know, some of the biggest forces that shape our world, well, they operate just below the surface in ways we don't even see coming. Today, we're going to dive into one of the most powerful of these hidden forces, prejudice. And we're going to start with a story that shows just how incredibly high the stakes can be. So let me set the scene. It's February 1999. We're in the Bronx in New York City. Four police officers are out on patrol, and they spot a young man, Amadou Diallo. He's just 23 years old, an immigrant from Guinea, and he's standing right on the steps of his own apartment building. To them, he looks suspicious. So as they get closer, he backs up into the doorway and starts to reach into his pocket. The police yell at him, "Show us your hands," but he keeps digging. And in a terrifying flash, a matter of seconds really, they fire 41 bullets. Amadou Diallo was hit 19 times. He died right there on his own doorstep. He wasn't reaching for a gun. He wasn't reaching for any kind of weapon. He was reaching for his wallet, probably just to pull out his ID. So what on earth happened here? I mean, was this just a clear-cut case of conscious, deliberate hatred? Or was it something else? Something more insidious, like a tragic accident fueled by a bias the officers didn't even know they had? That's the gray area we're going to be exploring today. Okay, so let's really get into this. The story of Amadou Diallo is, tragically, a perfect example of what social psychologists call non-conscious bias, or implicit bias. It's a kind of prejudice that can steer our actions without us ever being aware of it. Now, before we go any further, it is so easy to point fingers in a situation like this, but it's way more useful to try and understand the psychology that's at play. Because whether we like it or not, prejudice is a pretty common human condition. We've all been judged, and let's be honest, we've all probably done a bit of uninformed judging ourselves. All right, so to really wrap our heads around this, we need to get our terms straight. Social psychologists have this really helpful way of breaking it down into a three-step process. So first up, you've got the stereotype. That's just an overgeneralized belief. And it's not always negative, right? Thinking all birds have wings is a stereotype. But a negative stereotype, like, say, female mechanics are unskilled, well, that can lead to step two, prejudice. That's the negative attitude, that gut feeling of distrust. And if you act on that feeling and you decide not to hire her, boom, that's step three, discrimination. So it's belief, then attitude, then action. Okay, so we've got the basics down, but here is where things get really interesting. We need to talk about the prejudice we can't see, the bias that just hums along automatically, completely under our conscious radar. This is what we call implicit bias. You know how we talk about our brains having two tracks? There's the conscious stuff we're aware of, and then there's all this unconscious processing happening in the background. Well, guess what? Prejudice works the exact same way. We have our explicit, conscious attitudes, and then we have these implicit, automatic ones that we don't even know are there. And this iceberg analogy is the perfect way to picture it. Our conscious beliefs, what we say we think, that's just the tip of the iceberg. The real heavyweight, the gigantic structure that's shaping our gut reactions and our split-second decisions is all that implicit bias lurking way down below the surface. Okay, so if these biases are totally unconscious, how in the world do you even measure them? Well, psychologists came up with a pretty clever tool to do exactly that. It's called the Implicit Association Test, or the IAT. And its whole job really is to get around the right answers we think we should give, and instead reveal the automatic associations our brains are making without asking our permission first. So here's a simplified version of how a test for age bias might work. In condition A, you have to sort images as fast as you can. You hit one key if you see a young face or a pleasant object, and another key for an old face or an unpleasant object. See how those are paired in a stereotypical way? Then they flip it for condition B. Now you have to pair young face with unpleasant object and old face with pleasant object. So just take a second. Which one of those sorting tasks do you think most people can do faster, A or B? If you guessed A, you are spot on. See, the crucial point is that most people are way faster when the pairings match common stereotypes. That tiny little delay in your reaction time when you're sorting the counter-stereotypical pairs, well, that reveals an implicit association your brain is making. In this case, it's connecting youth with good and old age with bad. And look, this is not just some abstract lab game. This stuff has some seriously scary predictive power in the real world. Check out this Yale study from 2012. Researchers sent science faculty identical resumes for a lab manager job. The only difference was the name at the top. John, or Jennifer? As you can see, John was offered a much higher starting salary, but it wasn't just about the money. He was also rated as more competent and more likely to be hired. But here's the real kicker. This bias was just as strong among the female faculty members. It's pervasive. So we've seen how powerful and, frankly, devastating implicit bias can be. But that kind of begs the question, right? Why do our brains even do this? Where does all this come from? Well, social psychology points to a couple of really deep-seated instincts. Two of the biggest drivers are something called the just world phenomenon and the in-group, out-group phenomenon. So the just world phenomenon is our brain's tendency to want to believe the world is fair, that people get what they deserve. It's a comforting idea, but it can lead us to do things like blame victims for their own bad luck. And then there's the in-group, out-group phenomenon, which is just a fancy way of saying we have this powerful automatic instinct to divide the world into us. And this us versus them instinct, it is shockingly easy to switch on. There's a classic experiment where a teacher will divide an entire classroom into two groups based on something completely and totally arbitrary. For instance, you could just separate the kids wearing sneakers from the kids who aren't. That's it. That is the entire basis for these two new groups. You now have the in-group and the out-group. Then the teacher asks each group to list some differences between them. And what happens next is just incredible. Almost immediately, the sneaker wearers start saying things like, they're just smarter than the people without sneakers. And the non-sneaker kids start calling the others trashy. In almost no time at all, each group starts puffing up its own status and putting down the other one, all because of a completely meaningless division. And that really brings us to our final thought here. This super simple experiment shows just how powerfully and automatically our minds create conflict. So the real question, the one I want to leave you with, is this. If our brains are wired to create these divides so easily over something as trivial as sneakers, what in the world does it take to recognize and overcome the biases that actually have life or death consequences?